Hello and welcome to this session. We are continuing with Marx. We began Marx with a very early text, which is on the Jewish question. And now today we will do the first chapter of Capital Volume 1. But before we do that, let me pose to you two questions from the last two sessions, which had to do with, or three sessions actually, which had to do with Smith and Marx on state and civil society, and pose to you two questions for you to consider before we move on. So let me go to our screen. How does Marx approach the problem posed by Smith of sympathy as the sentiment which holds social life together, and self-interest as the force that brings prosperity to all? Now, you'll remember that in the two books that we considered by Adam Smith, sympathy was the predominant topic which Smith discussed in relation to what he called sociability, the practices, the ideas, in fact, even the emotions that go into the coming together of people into a common social life, and what is it that holds together that social life. And he fundamentally discussed what he called sympathy, which is fellow feeling for others, consideration for others. And that, according to Smith, was the glue which held together society. And then when he spoke more specifically of the wealth of nations, of the wealth of a particular group of people, of a country, there his principal focus was on pursuing self-interest. And his basic argument was, a very influential argument, was that in civil society, or he didn't, civil society was a term which has already been introduced by the Scottish Enlightenment philosophers, Ferguson most specifically, but self-interest, especially in the buying and selling of commodities in the market, that was principally guided by the pursuit of self-interest. What is it that I need? What out of all my needs can I produce myself? And what do I have to get from other people? And that is the principal sentiment with which people enter into relations in the marketplace. And Smith's argument was that if people only pursued their own self-interest without regard for the interest of others, then in fact the consequence would be, the effect of it, of everything, would be that everyone would in fact be better off. Now, Marx approaches, you could say, the same problem, but as we noticed in when we were discussing the Jewish question, Marx on the Jewish question, he emphasized once again, these two domains. One of civil society, and Marx was calling this civil society in the sense in which Hegel, just before him, among German philosophers, defined civil society as that domain of the satisfaction of needs, right? It's the domain where needs are satisfied. And in that domain of civil society, Marx basically said that they acted as individuals with their own interests, right? They were different, each had a different interest. They were marked by differences in the property which they held, in the education which they received, in the religions which they pursued. They were all different. And each was marked essentially as by their individual interests. This is the domain of civil society. Whereas there was the domain of the state, which guaranteed these differences and the freedom of individuals to pursue their interests in civil society. And that guarantee was provided by the state, which formally was founded on the sovereignty of the people. So everybody was a citizen, all citizens participated, and in that sense, as citizens, they all were in solidarity. They had come together. But the interesting difference with Smith, of course, was that Marx clearly did not believe that civil society, the pursuit of self-interest in civil society, would make everybody better off, that everyone would prosper, because clearly, as Marx hinted even in his early works, and as we will see now in Capital, which of course is the most rigorously argued theoretical work of Marx, Marx would argue that this domain of civil society was in fact marked by exploitation, exploitation of one class, the class of property owners or the owners of capital, their exploitation of the laboring population who had no property. They had property rights, but they had no property. Okay, and that is the key structural relationship in civil society under conditions of capitalist production. And that is, of course, the domain that we will now look at. So you could say that Marx actually approaches the same question that Smith posed, but answers that question in a very different way. The second question I was posing was, does the separation of the state and the domain as the domain of individual citizenship and civil society as that of private interest, this is Marx's definition, does it hold in India today? Okay, and you could think about this question as we go along, because we will return to this sort of posing of the relevance of the theories, the modern theories of society that are developed in Europe in particular in the 19th and 20th centuries, and how relevant those modern theories or theories of modern or modern social thought, Western social thought, how relevant it is in understanding what's going on in India in recent times. We will come back to this question several times later. So with that, let me move on specifically to, let me go, where is it? I have to do, I can't find, just a minute. I can't get to,
Partha, are you looking for a slide in particular?
no, I'm looking for this, the slideshow.
Okay, it's if you just press F5, or if you go
F5.
top, slideshow, it's slideshow, the menu on top will also.
Yeah, no, but the menu is actually covered.
Okay. Right.
So I can't get out of that. Let me see. Okay. Now I've got it.
You found it? Okay.
Yeah, got it.
Yeah. So from current slide.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Sorry about that.
Okay.
All right. Yes. Okay. So capital. Now the volume which most of you probably have is or have seen is this. This is the new English translation published in 1971, the Penguin edition. The edition which I have always used is a much older volume. Some of you may have seen it. This is the volume that used to be published from Moscow in the good old days. That is actually an 1887 English translation. It's an older translation, but we will use the new one, which is now the Capital Volume 1 was published in 1867. And the history of this book is interesting in the sense that it's a 3-volume work as we know it now. Volumes 2 and 3 were written by Marx, but they were left unpublished by him for several years because he was not satisfied with the way he wanted further work to be done on it. So they were unpublished at the time of Marx's death. Engels published volumes 2 and 3. He sort of edited those 2 volumes and put them together, and they were published after Marx's death in 1883. Capital, there is a subtitle which is a critique of political economy. A critique of political economy. Now, critique, I have probably mentioned this earlier, but let me remind you once more what critique is. Critique is not any kind of criticism. All criticism is not critique. Critique is a very specific kind of examination of a body of theory, which actually examines the origins, the conditions of possibility, and the limits of that set of theories. In other words, it examines how that particular theory or set of concepts, perhaps, how it emerged. What are the historical conditions out of which those kinds of questions, those kinds of framing of problems emerged. And so that would define the conditions of the possibility of that set of theories. And it then examines how those problems have been formulated, what kinds of answers were provided, and the limits of that inquiry at the time. In other words, it will often pose the question as unresolved problems within that body of theory. Problems that were posed but not properly answered, or possibly even questions that should have emerged but did not at that point of time, because those were the historical limits of that particular body of theory. So political economy, as it had emerged by this time, principally, of course, in England, and by this time, the the sort of two greatest theorists in political economy were, of course, Adam Smith and then David Ricardo. Smith and Ricardo were the two, but there were several others. And this was the body of what would then become today be known as classical economics, had already emerged. And Marx, who, as I've mentioned, who was educated in Germany under the influence, the very dominating influence of Hegel. This was idealist philosophy. He had his training was almost entirely in philosophy. But then from philosophy and that early set of writings in 1843-44 already showed that Marx was moving from the study of ideas, of purely intellectual history, into a consideration of what was happening in actual society, right? Rather than thinking about purely normative questions, questions of abstract theory, to move to questions of how to explain what is going on in the actual world. And that's where he moves to the study of political theory. This is especially after he moves to London in 1848. He then onwards, his routine was to come to the British Library in London, come in there in the morning and work there until evening, almost every day. And that is where he began his study of political economy. And that Capital is the result of that study. It is a study of the sphere of civil society in the era of capitalist production. Civil society as it actually operated under conditions of the production of commodities. I should also point out that the word capitalism or capitalist production, these were not words that Marx actually uses. Capitalism, he did not use at all. That's a term which actually emerges much later. It emerges more in the 1880s and 90s. Capitalism to indicate an entire social order, as it were. Marx, as you will know, in Capital, he always refers to this particular society. He sometimes does it call it industrial production, but production of commodities. Sometimes he will call it generalized commodity production. That is to say, a world in which all human needs, or most human needs, are satisfied through the buying and selling of commodities. That becomes the distinctive feature of what later on we all today refer to as capitalist society, or the era of capitalist production. Okay. Now, mark the very first sentence of the first chapter, which is called the commodity. The very first sentence. Let me read it out for you. First sentence of the book. The wealth of societies in which the capitalist mode of production, capitalist mode of production prevails, appears as an immense collection of commodities. Now, appears is an important term here. Wealth is also an important term here. Mark, he is, in a sense, this is a reference to Smith and a reference to the basic concern of all of political economy, which is about the wealth of nations. Appears, and this goes back to, again, a very fundamental technique in Hegel's philosophy. How does one approach critique? How does one actually examine the conditions of possibility of particular kinds of activities in society, or even of particular kinds of ideas that prevail in society. How does one examine those conditions? And the first thing that Hegel insists on is to actually set aside all the mediations that occur when we perceive particular phenomena, things. So things that appear before us, a lot of them, even though they appear to us naturally, let's say we see something or we feel something or we hear something, right? These are physical sensations that occur. But when we describe what we have seen, we actually use a whole set of mediations that language has interposed, right? And those mediations are already part of the way a society has conceived of, framed, problematized particular things, particular objects. Okay, so one of the first things that Hegel would insist on is to set aside, as far as possible, set aside those mediations, those elements, those theories, those concepts, those habits, right, that intervene when we describe something as something that has appeared before us. Go to the appearance, just the appearance, as close to that appearance as possible. And so, therefore, we are trying to describe capitalist society. And when we say capitalist society, what is it that we would describe as the first thing about capitalist society that occurs to us? And Marx says, what it appears is an immense collection of commodities. This is the difference, the immediate difference, unmediated difference between a capitalist society and any other kind of society. So, for instance, you can compare this ourselves. Think of a sort of very remote village that you have seen, a very remote village somewhere where it's, you don't have very close communications with the outside world. And how would you compare that with a big city? And the first difference would strike us would be that in this remote village, there are very few objects. There are very few things that are being sold, bought and sold, right? Commodities. There are very few commodities that you will see. And the first thing in the big city that you see are commodities, whether you see them in the various shops and markets and so on, or in all the advertising, etc., which every street is full of them. That's the immense collection of commodities. And that's the first thing that is an unmediated. This is you have not theorized or anything of the kind. Anybody who comes and first encounters this society of capitalist production would be struck by this collection of commodities. The critique will begin with this immediate phenomenon. So why is Marx beginning with the commodity as the first thing before in a critique of the sphere of civil society under capitalist production? And you have to begin with the commodity because that's the first thing, the first distinctive thing that appears before us when we think or when we encounter capitalist society. What is it that is distinctive about the commodity? And here, Marx, this is how critique will proceed now, to actually question what appears, this immediate appearance, and to begin to analytically separate out distinct features that constitute this this immediate appearance? What is it that lies behind? In other words, from appearance, one is now moving into the constituent parts, right, which don't appear immediately, This is where you have to apply your analytical techniques in order to go behind or go inside this thing that appears immediately. And the first distinction that Marx draws is between these two aspects of a commodity. Commodity, remember, are things that are being bought and sold in the market. A commodity is something you have either bought or somebody has sold to you, right? So both of those things have to happen. So such a thing, whatever thing it be, anything there, surrounding you in your or your table in your room, you'll probably find dozens and dozens of commodities. Now, what characterizes that commodity? Two things. The first two things: use value and exchange value. A commodity has to be useful. That is to say, it must satisfy some human want. Okay? It is a commodity, somebody has bought it, you have bought it, because it satisfies something that you need. And that object satisfies that need. Now, how does that thing acquire that use value? How does it come to have that use value? And it consists of natural elements plus the labor spent in producing the thing. So, well, here I have a pen, okay? A pen. It is useful. It satisfies some use, some need that I have. I need something to write with. Why is it valuable? How does it have come to have this value? Because it consists of certain natural elements. Well, let me find something which is even more natural. Here, this is a pencil. Okay, very simple pencil. So, natural element, the first obvious natural element is the wood, right? The wood casing. And then there is a lead inside, right? These are natural elements. The wood is a natural element. The lead, in some form or the other, is a natural element, has to be mined, it has to be found from somewhere. And then there is the labor that is spent in making this thing, right? That is what constitutes the use value. All right. But the pencil becomes a commodity that is bought and sold. It also acquires another kind of value, right? Which is the quantitative relation in which things exchange. A quantitative. So the first thing that you should notice is that the use value is a purely qualitative thing. The use that this pencil has for me is a qualitative thing. You cannot measure it, right? So if I were to compare between the pen and the pencil, right? They're both, you could even say that they satisfy the same need. Although if you were careful, you would say that I can do things with the pen which I could not do with the pencil, right? It's a specific kind of writing, or producing a kind of mark, or for instance, the length of time which that written document will last. A pencil written document probably lasts less than the one written with a pen. So you can make all of those, more subtle differences in terms of what my specific need is and which of these two objects would satisfy that need better. But these are qualitative differences. You cannot quantitatively measure, right, the use of the pen with the use of the pencil, because they are qualitatively not exactly the same. And so you could not compare. You could possibly compare two pens, right? And you'd say, this is a better pen than that one. That's possible. We'll come to this in a little bit. But the use value itself is a qualitative thing. Whereas when you come to the exchange value, what would this pen exchange for? That is a quantitative relation. It could exchange for, possibly, and we'll come to these kinds of elementary exchanges. A pen could possibly exchange for 2 pencils or 3 pencils. That is a quantitative relation, right? And of course, normally we use the exchange value, or we express the exchange value in terms of money. We will come to the role of money, and we will say the pen costs so much, the pencil costs so much. And then, of course, these two things can be brought, can be compared, right, in terms of their exchange values, because they are quantitative, right? Now, the quantitative amount, shall we say, of exchange value, it appears to be, again, accidental. Accidental, why? Because the natural properties of the thing have nothing to do with its exchange value. The natural properties of wood or lead actually have nothing to do with how much this pencil would cost. I mean, it costs, I have no idea, maybe 10 rupees or 15 rupees, right? Why is it 15 rupees? It's got nothing to do with the natural properties of the lead or the natural properties of the wood. It has to do with some very other different things. So why is it 10 rupees? It would seem to be accidental. There's nothing inherent in this object or in this pencil which explains why it should cost 15 rupees and not, let us say, 200 rupees. There's nothing inherent in this. It will be determined by other things. We'll come to this in a minute. So these are the two aspects of any commodity, right? The use value and the exchange value. Now, Marx has already pointed out that the use value of a commodity consists of, on the one side, the natural properties of what it is made of and the labor that goes into it. Now, labor, again, the labor that goes into the making of this pencil, it's a very specific kind of labor, right? You can possibly imagine, even if it was made in a factory, I'm sure this pencil was made in a factory, but the specific labor that goes into the making of a pencil cannot be compared with any other concrete labor. That is to say, the labor which goes into the making of the pen would be a very different kind of labor. You know, it's not the same technologies, it's not the same techniques of work, right, which produces a pencil and those that produce a pen. They are not the same, right? They are concretely, this is what Marx is referring to as concrete labor. Concretely, they are very different processes, okay? If you think of all the things that are surrounding you, for instance, you must have a phone or a laptop, right? Think of all the concrete labors that has gone into the making of that phone or making of that laptop, okay? think of all the hundreds of little parts. They've probably been produced in 10, 15, 50 different countries, right? If you go further back into the raw materials, which may be minerals of all kinds, right? Which were mined from various countries and then brought together, industrially produced into the component parts of your laptop or your phone, okay? The concrete labors are enormously varied and simply cannot be compared with the concrete labor that goes into the making of something else. Think of, well, I have here a little case, right, in which I've put my pens and pencils. So this one seems to be made of little strips of wood, but I'm sure these were made by hand by some craftsperson somewhere, I don't know exactly where, but they were made by hand, not in industrially produced condition. That's one kind of concrete labor, okay? That simply cannot be compared with the labor, the concrete labor that has gone into industrially produced, telephones, or think of the books and the paper, the industrially produced paper, for instance. The concrete labors cannot be compared because they are concretely different, discrete, different. There is no common standard by which you can compare them. But when things exchange, the concrete forms of labor in each commodity disappears, right? The concrete forms disappear. So you could say that, as I said before, that one pen might exchange with 5 pencils. If that actually happens, then the concretely different forms of labor in each of these things have disappeared, right? What is it that is then equalized? What is it that becomes common there? What remains is human labor in the abstract. Now, why labor? And it's another interesting thing. Why only labor? What happens to the natural? For instance, in the pencil, as I said, there are at least 2 natural components, wood and lead. Marx would say, well, wood exists in nature. But for that wood in nature, that substance wood in nature, to be converted into something that would become a concretely useful pencil would require labor. Labor will transform that wood, natural wood substance, raw material, right, into this particular form of the pencil, into which, once again, the lead, which in the mineral form is there underneath, underground somewhere in some part of the world, it requires human labor to transform that mineral substance into this particular form of a stick of lead, which you can insert into this piece of wood in order to make a useful thing, which we call the pencil, right? So here, what has been equalized when the pencil is exchanged with some other thing, right, is human labor in the abstract. This is a very crucial concept that Marx introduces in this chapter, abstract labor, which is distinct from the actual concrete kinds of labor that goes into the making of specific things. When that thing becomes a commodity, that is to say, it can be exchanged with any other commodity, right? Then what is being exchanged is abstract, human labor in the abstract. That is what is equalized when some specific exchange of one set of commodities with another set of commodities actually takes place in the marketplace. When this exchange takes place, What is equalized is human labor in the abstract. So what is human labor, abstract labor? It is identical human labor power. Labor power. Now, this is, again, is very specifically Marxian term. Labor power, as distinct from concrete labor. Labor power is that common substance in all commodity production. So whether what is being produced is a pencil or a motor car or a piece of cloth, right? Each of these things involve very specific kinds of labor, very specific kinds of concrete labor. But to the extent that they are all commodities which can be exchanged, right? They all embody identical human labor power. And this human labor power can be measured. It can be measured. Concrete labor, as I mentioned before, cannot be measured. But abstract labor can be measured. Measured by a scale which is the socially average unit. Socially average. What is this socially average? It's the socially necessary labor time. So labor power, abstract labor or labor power is measured by labor time. It's the socially necessary labor time that is required to produce any use value under normal conditions of production with the average degree of skill and intensity prevalent in a given society. Now, Marx is using two very crucial simplifying assumptions here. It is under normal conditions of production and average degree of skill and intensity. So it is possible, even in a given society, right, for, let us say, one factory, right, where you have a particularly skilled set of people, set of workers, and they produce things at with a more than average degree of skill. Or perhaps there is a factory which has technology that is in advance of the average. And so they also produce things at not under normal conditions, right? But under advanced technology compared to the rest. Now, in terms of determining the abstract labor or the socially average unit of labor power, these deviant kinds of production conditions or skills will not become the standard. The standard would be the average degree of skill and the normal conditions of normal technological conditions of production. That is what determines what is the socially necessary labor time to produce some useful object. Okay, and that determines, that is the measure of this identical human labor power which goes into the production of any commodity. And this is what Marx identifies as the value of commodity. The value of a commodity. So mind you, value is not just the exchange value. Value is not certainly the use value. Value is the socially necessary labor time required for its production. The socially necessary labor time. So this pen, the value of this pen is given by the socially necessary labor time required for its production under average conditions and with average degrees of skill. Okay, so mark very carefully that Marx is identifying the value of a commodity as measured by labor time. Labor time. Not by money. We'll come to the function of money a little later. This is where Marx has gone beyond appearances. When things appear as commodities, right? Whenever we think of commodities and what's the value of the pen? What's the value of the laptop? And we immediately think of a figure in money. Okay? But as Marx is trying to show, this appearance of money is actually only an appearance. Money comes in much, much later. What is exchanged in actuality are labor times, socially necessary labor time, which is required for the production of commodities. That is its value. How do values change? Values are not necessarily fixed. Values can go up or down. Improvement in productivity of labor brings down the labor time necessary for its production. Things become cheaper. That is, their values are reduced. So, for instance, okay, you've probably seen it, but those of us who are much older, we've seen, for instance, initially when you had the mobile phones, and certainly when computers and laptops were introduced for the first time, they used to cost far more than what they cost now. Okay, even 20 years ago, 15 years ago, laptops cost a great deal more than they cost now. The reason why they've become cheaper is because improvements in the productivity of labor, techniques, technologies have been found by which less labor time is required to produce the same object, right? And that, of course, happens through competition. That's a more complicated question of what is it that brings about improvements in productivity. It's a very crucial question. But when productivity improves, less labor time is required for its production. Things become cheaper. Cheaper, which basically means their value. Things have less value. It doesn't necessarily mean that their use value is greater or less. It has probably same use value. So now think a little bit carefully about the difference between use values and value. Okay? Things can have use value without having value. And Marx gives the examples of air, of virgin soil, natural water sources, for instance, all of which are useful. They have use value, but they do not have value. Why? Because they are not exchanged as commodities. They are not commodities. Okay? Things can have use value and be produced by labor without being a commodity, such as things produced for self-consumption. Such things are not values. So think of cloth, for instance. Cloth that you buy in the market, clearly it has use value, of course, which is why you buy it, but it has value because it is being produced for being a commodity in order to be sold. But think of, let us say, a weaver who produces some cloth which is used for family consumption, which is not sold. Now, that object, that thing, the piece of cloth, has use value, but they are not values. It has no value because it is not a commodity. It was not produced to be a commodity. Now, finally, nothing can be a value without having use values. Useless things produced by labor are not values. So unfortunately, for instance, I had a factory and it was producing pens, but the pens can't be used for writing, right? I've done everything. It's been produced by labor. Labor has been spent on it, but those pens have no value because they will not exchange for anything. So nothing can be a value without having use value, but useless things, therefore, produced by labor cannot be values. Now, why are values characteristic only of capitalist production? It's not just the question of labor, because labor is the creator of use values in any kind of society, right? Even if you think of a pre-capitalist agrarian society, peasants would cultivate the land, labor is being spent. What is produced as crops, they have been produced by labor, but to the extent that those crops are produced primarily for self-consumption of the families of the farmers, they have no value. Only in capitalist societies do commodities have value, right? Only in capitalist societies do. In capitalist societies, we have what Marx would call generalized commodity production. Generalized commodity production. Virtually everything that satisfies our needs has to be bought, sold in the market as commodities. All such things are commodities and therefore have value. This is going back to this question of the simple average, the average socially necessary labor time, which is the social average. Simple average labor in a particular society at a given particular time, is a given. This is the standard, the measure, which is the so simple average labor. Now, in that same society, you can have more advanced kinds of production, intensified production, complex labor. Okay, so think of very basic rudimentary factory production, right? And compare that with some advanced chemical factory or pharmaceutical factory with very advanced technology, very high levels of skill required. What is the difference between the labor of the simple worker in a basic factory and the labor of a very skilled technician in an advanced pharmaceutical or chemical factory? And Marx is basically saying that what the complex labor is simply a multiples of simple average labor, right? They are congealed into that labor time, but that labor time, let's say it is 5 times or 10 times or more. It depends on how you compute it. But they can all be compared or brought down to the same standard, right? One is simply, the complex is simply multiples of the simple. So, having any questions so far?
Can I ask 2 questions, sir?
Yes.
My first question is in the Capital that was published by the Soviet publication.
Yes,
There is a reference to useful labor. So,
yes,
is this useful labor and complete labor both are same?
yes,
Uh,
yes. It's useful labor is labor which produces things of use. Yes, it's the
and
same as concrete labor. Yes.
and the second question is when Marx is referring to this socially necessary labor time, what does he mean by this social?
So
Social.
labor
What is
time, labor time, which is the prevailing social average. So how will you measure what is the average? The average of a particular society. Now, it's a very interesting question that you asked. So, for instance, the average, socially average labor time to produce, let us say, cloth in England after the Industrial Revolution, okay, is not the same as the socially average labor time required to produce cloth in a different society which has not had the Industrial Revolution. Okay, there too, there is a basic socially average labor time which is required to produce cloth. But you cannot compare the socially average labor time in industrial England with the labor time that is spent in producing cloth again in other countries at the same time, because the societies are different, right? The societies are different and the social conditions of production are different, right? So the society is simply saying socially necessary. You can then ask the question, what is the relevant society here? How far does society go? And you can, if you come to more contemporary times, these are very interesting kinds of problems that you will get. You would probably find similar technologies being used for the production of lots of industrial commodities. And yet, for instance, let's say the level of uh, mm, the quantities or the value of the goods or needs, subsistence needs of laborers in, let us say, an African country is very different from the subsistence needs of laborers. So think of the production of cloth again, industrial cloth, factory made cloth. The uh, the subsistence needs of laborers in in a factory, in a cloth factory, textile factory, let us say in Ghana or Uganda, all right, will be quite different from the subsistence needs of a laborer in, let us say, Britain, in a textile factory in Britain or Germany. Now, why is that? Because the socially necessary labor time to produce those subsistence goods, what would be the minimum necessity of subsistence in different countries, will be different in different periods of history, partly for natural reasons. So, for instance, the subsistence needs of workers, socially average, subsistence needs of workers in a cold country, right, would be quite different from subsistence needs in a tropical country. Uh, these are questions that Marx actually does remark upon. Uh, and of course, historically, there are differences. What Marx is simply, these are relevant questions in asking what is it that constitutes this socially necessary labor time? Why are they different? He is actually leaving these kinds of differences out of the analysis for the sake of moving ahead with the basic conceptual task of examining capitalist production itself, by simply assuming that for any relevant set of production conditions, there is a socially necessary average, right? This socially necessary average is variable. It is variable over time if with changes in technology. It is also variable from society to society. right? So this is the crucial argument here, socially necessary labor time. Yeah, okay.
So can we
Anything
say,
else?
yeah, can we say then that this abstract labor is the average labor time? Abstract equals to average.
Socially average labor time required to produce value, to produce a commodity. Yes. It is a socially average. It is a social average because this abstract labor and how you compare it, we won't go as far because it is described later on in the chapter on buying and selling of labor power. What does labor power exchange for? How are wages determined? And there the crucial argument is that, like any other commodity, labor time or labor power is also a commodity and will be bought and sold at exactly the same way in which other commodities are bought and sold. So just as commodities, any commodity is bought or sold at its value, labor power as a commodity, when a worker comes to a factory and sells labor power, right? The worker does not sell himself or herself, right? It is the labor time that is sold. So 8 hours a day, that is the contract for which wages are paid. That 8 hours a day, how much that labor time would represent in terms of the value produced, that is a social average. That is a social average. And that social average is given by how much is required, what are the subsistence goods, the food, the clothes, the housing, the other kinds of amenities that are required for a worker to reproduce that labor time that is spent in one day's labor in order to work for the next day. So it's the reproduction of that labor time. What is required for that? This is exactly how values the reproduction of capital, right? The calculations that go into it. What would be required in order for production to take place the next day? So similarly, for the laborer too, what would it require? What kind of subsistence goods would be required for that labor power to be reproduced for the next period of production? That is what determines the value of that labor power, that time of labor power, right? And that is the wage. That is the wage. But that again, as I've just mentioned, will be different in different countries under different social conditions. It's a social average. There is a socially average set of subsistence goods that would be considered necessary for the worker to be able to work the next day. It varies under different conditions, both natural conditions as well as historically given social conditions. Okay. Anything else? Okay, let's move on. Accidental form of value. Now, these are fairly simple relations that Marx is positing in order to show what happens when an exchange takes place. So 20 yards of linen could be transformed into one coat. Okay, this is a simple exchange. One coat exchanging for 20 yards of linen. This may be a result of a particular exchange with no general significance. It may just happen at one place at one time. But the linen represents a relative value that finds in this particular exchange an equivalent value in a coat. Okay, so there is an equivalence which has been established when you say 20 yards of linen can exchange with one coat. There is an equivalence that is established between those two things. If this exchange becomes prevalent, so this can happen accidentally at one particular point of exchange. But if that is a standard prevalent form of exchange, right, then you could say that 40 yards of linen will exchange with 2 coats and similar multiples. It's no longer accidental anymore, right? That becomes the prevailing rate of exchange. 40 yards with 2 coats, 60 yards with 3 coats, etc. Here the coat becomes a measure for the exchange value of linen, right? It is as if you are measuring the exchange value of that cloth, right, in terms of coats. Here, concrete labor manifests as abstract labor. Labor has been abstracted here because the private labor that goes into the making of coats or the making of cloth, right, now becomes a social form of labor. Now here, Marx makes a very interesting sort of aside remark, which says that even though Aristotle saw this very clearly, right, the idea of equivalent value, but he could not explain equivalent value in terms of homogeneous human labor, because in Aristotle's time, right, socially, human labor was not homogeneous. Labor was what was performed by those at the bottom of society, many of them who were slaves, many of them in conditions of, without rights. They were not members of the so-called polis, right, of the society of those who were the householders, right, the heads of families, of propertied people, right, who were the consumers, you might say, of most commodities that were bought and sold. And so, although Aristotle clearly saw this phenomenon of the equivalent value, he could not explain it. He could not see that there could be homogeneous human labor behind it, because in this society there was no homogeneous human labor. In other words, Marx is again, this is go back to what I said about critique. He is pointing out why, for instance, it is only under conditions of industrial production in England, right, in that sort of society, that it becomes for something like political economy to emerge, the science of political economy to emerge. It becomes possible only there, because it is only there in that society for the first time that you have a generalized form, right, where commodity production is the general form of production. It's only then that homogeneous human labor becomes the prevalent standard by which all value of all commodities can be measured. Otherwise, until this point, this possibility does not even arise, right? And so the possibility of a science of political economy could not have arisen. Now, from equivalent value, this generally prevalent, it's the next step where a particular commodity becomes socially recognized as the general equivalent or measure for all commodities. And this becomes the money form. Okay? Now, as we all know that there are in different societies at different historical periods, different things, different objects have been recognized, socially recognized as money, as the general equivalent. So in Marx's time, it was gold, which was recognized as the standard form of money. Gold as money does not have any concrete use value as gold. It is only the general equivalent. So very interesting point here. There is still gold that is used or that has concrete use value. So, for instance, gold that is used to make jewelry, for instance, that was still prevalent, is still prevalent now. Okay, but that is not gold as money. The gold which is money, in other words, gold coins, right? That has no concrete use value. It is simply the general equivalent for all commodities, socially recognized. Social recognition is absolutely crucial here. We won't go into the questions about how social recognition actually becomes legitimate, how people come to accept it, what is the role of the state here. In many historical instances, you find that, for instance, the use of coins as general equivalents. It's not necessarily true that only kings or some sovereign authority would issue coins, as is now the case. Many bankers, for instance, even traders, big traders, would issue their own coins. That was often the case earlier instances. But even metal coins, I mean, gold and silver obviously are the most, but you have the use of many other metals as coins, in the form of coins, used for as this general equivalent. And of course, you have also instances in history, as well as in societies where you do not have the use of metal coins and so on, but many other kinds of, for instance, shells. Kodi was a very common use, even 200 or 300 years ago in many places in India. You did not have a large circulation of coins, but things like shells and so on were often used as commodities. Very interestingly, you even today, under very modern advanced conditions, you often have situations where the trust in the general equivalent declines for various reasons, for some crisis, for instance. And you have often a reversal into conditions of exchange where all sorts of other objects become available and socially recognized as the general equivalent in the absence of coins, right? For instance, you probably had this experience even in India, when, for instance, there have been occasions where small change, coins of a smaller value, let's say 1 rupee coins or 50 paisa coins and so on, would become in short supply. And very often in shops and so on, they would give you all sorts of small objects, commodities, other commodities, in place of that small change, right? It's still possible. So what Marx is pointing out is that the appearance of money is crucially dependent upon a socially recognized general equivalent. How this social recognition emerges is a historical question. Different countries, different societies in different historical periods have had specific socially recognized general equivalents. In Marx's time, it is gold. Very interestingly, in Marx's time, paper money was not in such wide circulation. It was very limited. Marx does not strongly speak about the impact of paper money as the general equivalent. It happens somewhat later, early 20th century onwards. Now, of course, we think of, when we speak of money, we think of paper money. And paper money, if you think of it, is purely a question of social recognition or trust. Why, for instance, you think of 100 rupee or a 500 rupee note, that's just a piece of paper. Why should we expect that with that piece of paper, I can walk into a shop, right, and buy commodities worth 500 rupees, and all I give in exchange is a piece of paper, right? That becomes possible because there is a general social trust in that piece of paper, that piece of paper with that particular embossed imprint on that paper, right? We all understand that there is the backing or guarantee that is offered by a state, right? And this state has the credibility that this money will, in fact, be worth what it claims to be, that piece of paper. There are occasions in many societies, even in modern societies, in our time, where this credibility actually collapses. We also have situations like demonetization, which we saw recently, right, where particular denominations were suddenly withdrawn from the market. And of course, it caused enormous chaos. But the whole point here is that the general equivalent of money actually appears at a particular point of time as the general equivalent for all commodities. This is not a particular specific exchange anymore. This general equivalent is valid for all values that are exchanged in the market. Now, anything else? Because we next move into a section of this chapter, which is very crucial, which is very specifically Marx's contribution, you might say, to political economy and this entire discussion, which Marx calls the fetishism of commodities. A fetish is when an object, an inanimate object, a thing, is believed to possess some animate properties, some properties that of living beings, right? So a fetish is when a particular object or thing is supposed to have some power over other things, some power over even human beings, okay? And of course, these powers are supposedly magical powers. When things are supposed to have this sort of magic-like powers, that is a fetish. And you can think of lots of fetishes that are in common circulation. Think of things that people will wear, stones and gems, or even sort of when, for instance, people claim to give you things to wear around your hand or your arm, for instance, in order to protect you from evil spirits, or protect you from diseases, or give you good luck, bring you good luck. All of those things, charms, for instance, charmed objects, these are all fetishes. And they belong supposedly to the world of religion and magic and religion. These are not supposed to be things that belong to the modern world of commodities, which is a secular world. Remember what we talked about last week, the discussion about the civil society, the civic world being populated by specific objects and so on, and the state, which was standing outside or above these differences. And the state was supposedly secular, separated from religion. But social life was not. Religion was prevalent in social life. This is a very interesting aspect that Marx is bringing forward, that even when under modern conditions of commodity production and exchange, right, you tend to think of the world of civil society as being largely secularized. People don't necessarily think of religion in the marketplace in this way. Marx is actually suggesting that there is a very subtle way in which commodities, which are the products of human labor, they appear to exist within social relations, not between humans, but between things. Just right? So commodities are supposed to have relations with other commodities. Things are more expensive, less expensive, more valuable, less valuable than other things. Each commodity is supposed to have a value, right, which is comparable with other things. But those values are believed to be inherent to those things themselves, to those commodities themselves. Okay? So they are believed to be relations between things rather than what lies behind, which is what Marx has shown so far, which is that commodities are commodities because they embody abstract, homogeneous human labor. So it is in fact the relation of values are in fact relations of abstract human labor. And so in effect, the relations between commodities are actually relations between humans, right? Of relations between humans in society. This is hidden. This is not seen. People think of commodities as being related to other commodities as things, right? Just as mysterious qualities are attributed to things by the religious imagination, making fetishes of them, so do commodities assume the fantastic character of being related among themselves by their exchange value, right? Things are said to be related to each other by their exchange value. This costs so much, the other things cost so much. Okay, that's the relation between commodities, between things. But in effect, those values have nothing to do with what is inherent in those commodities as things. They are related relations of the human labor, the homogeneous human labor that is embodied in those things, right? So this is what is hidden. This is what Marx is calling the fetishism. And he goes into a whole discussion on this, on the implications of this. Things are produced in their concrete variety by individual producers. The sum total of their labors is the aggregate labor of society. But the specific social character of each producer's labor is not shown before things are exchanged. Okay, the specific social character of each producer's labor, right? This does not appear at all before things are exchanged. It's only when they come to be exchanged that you think, oh, the pen is made by this, or you can think, if you want to, that the pen represents this producer's labor and something else represents a different set of producers' labors. Exchange establishes a uniform social status of labor distinct from their particular use values. We've already seen this. With generalized exchange in a society, therefore, where virtually everything has to be acquired through exchange, through the buying and selling of commodities, generalized exchange, individual labor acquires a twofold social character. It must satisfy a definite human want, and therefore that's the use value, and hence retain its concrete difference. It's a specifically concretely different thing. And two, it must produce things that can be exchanged, thus equalizing different kinds of labor by abstracting from them the common quality, which is human labor power. But this scientific discovery does not change the ordinary perception of that products are different because of their inherent difference in value. Just as the knowledge of the chemical composition of air does not change the atmosphere. This is a very interesting remark. What Marx is saying is that just as the discoveries of modern chemistry, of modern physical science, right, about the composition of the air does not change our ordinary perception of air. So the fact that the air consists not just of one thing, but various kinds of gases, right, which comprise air. This is a discovery of modern chemical science. But this discovery does not change our perception of the atmosphere. In the same way, the discovery of political economy, that the value of commodity is actually measured by abstract human labor power. This discovery does not change the ordinary perception of commodities, which is that commodities are related as things, right? By their values, by their exchange values. That is the ordinary perception. That continues, that does not change. In other words, the discoveries of political economy do not change the ordinary perception that people have about commodities. This is the fetishism which therefore continues, right? The belief that commodities themselves have some inherent values which exchange in the market according to their relative amounts. So in bourgeois society, the generalized exchange of commodities is an established social fact. Consequently, prices of commodities in money are believed to represent their values. That is what people ordinarily believe. That commodities, the values of commodities are given by their prices in money. The universal money form conceals, instead of disclosing, the social relations between producers. When producers of coats and boots compare their products in silver, they do not see the relations between their private laborers and the collective labor of society. Okay, that is conceived, right? The universal money form, that is supposed to give the relation, the exchange values between different commodities. And that is what people perceive. Once again, why is the appearance of this kind? What Marx has done is he's taken the immediate phenomenon of commodities as what is the most striking appearance of characteristic of capitalist society. He's gone behind it and has shown that commodities, the values of commodities, are actually the values of homogeneous labor time that is required to produce those commodities. But that is not what appears. And he's explained why. He's explained why that is not actually seen, right? Even though the science of political economy is able to show it. But fetishism, this belief that things themselves have somehow this mysterious property by which they relate to other things, this continues. He also then talks about this very classic production of the bourgeois imagination, Robinson Crusoe, famous story. Daniel Defoe, 1719, somewhere thereabouts. Shovik, 1719, is it? Somewhere there, early 18th century. Now, I don't know if people today read Robinson Crusoe, but I don't have to repeat the story. I'm sure you should know it. Crusoe, of course, is marooned in an island, shipwreck. There is nobody in that island. And so the story is about how this individual Englishman, he sets about building an entire life. How does he satisfy his needs? And he has to satisfy all of his needs through his own labor. He has to find things, he has to work on them, and he ends up, producing most all of the things that he requires. So to fulfill his needs, Crusoe had to perform a variety of tasks. He had to do all of those things. So some required more labor than others, from the production of food to clothes, to build some sort of shelter for himself. All of it has to be done by himself. He put these costs down. Now, this is what is most interesting about this Englishman being an Englishman. Marx says he, of course, has to maintain accounts. But how does he account? There is no general equivalent. There is no money. There is no exchange. What he is producing are not commodity. So he puts these costs down in his account book in terms of labor time. Right? How long did it take to produce this compared to something else? This was because they were all products of his own labor. No exchange was required. The value of things did not acquire a fantastic form. Right? In this case, the knowledge of the value of things is directly achieved because there is no exchange here. Nothing is hidden. Everything is measured in terms of the labor it took to produce each of these things. He was trying to compare them because he has account books. And the comparisons are all in terms of his own labor time. His own labor time. He does not even have to compare with the skills of other people and so on, which would amount to producing some kind of social average. There is no averaging here necessary because there is only one producer. So think of this as an imaginary, of course, there is no society here, as an imaginary producer who is producing everything by himself without any social exchanges with anybody else, right? The fact that things are produced through his own labor is directly understood and known, and in fact measured. Think of now more historically known social forms. In feudal Europe, laboring serfs were dependent on lords. Service and products were paid for in kind. There was no intervention of money. Money was very little in circulation. Only sort of big traders and merchants and so on would exchange in money. But as far as sort of most people were concerned, the use of money was almost zero. Social productions between laborers appeared as personal relations and were not disguised under social relations between things, right? In feudal society, therefore, things were known to be produced, crops were produced by serfs, by peasants who were dependent peasants who paid rent and so on and so forth, or mostly in kind. Okay, so the relations between laborers appeared as personal. So, and go back to sort of even exchanges when it took place were in kind. So you probably did have exchanges between, let us say, farmers and weavers, or craftspeople of various kinds. Those exchanges again were in kind. And so there was no understanding that objects or things were related in themselves to each other. when you have situations of common labor, such as in pastoral, hunting-gathering societies, pastoral societies, labor is usually performed collectively. So it's not individually parceled out into plots of land and so on. There are many different forms of distribution of the product according to social status, abilities, and needs. So there is collective labor. The product itself then has to be distributed among the different individuals in that society. That was done. Different societies had different ways of doing it. They were not necessarily egalitarian. There were often gradations of rank and status and etc. And so there were different principles by which they were distributed, but individual labor power is directly understood to be a portion of the common labor of society, right? Each individual has a certain portion of that common labor and the product of that common labor. Marx and Engels called this stage of society primitive communism, right? There is a whole, particularly in the Communist Manifesto, there's a whole simplified understanding of the stages of what's called modes of production. Production for self-consumption. Imagine a community of free individuals where the means of production are held in common. Everything is divided into two parts. One part is kept aside as fresh means of production, and the other consumed by each according to the labor time expended. Social relations of both production and distribution are simple and self-evident. Once again, it's according to the labor that is contributed to each that the final product is then distributed. Everything is self-consumption. There is no exchange. There is nothing that exchanges for value. This is where the fetishism question Marx is generalizing. The religious world is the reflex of the real world. In bourgeois society, where commodities are exchanged and private labor is reduced to homogeneous abstract labor, Protestant Christianity, with its conception of abstract man, is the appropriate religion. Now remember, if you remember what Marx's remark against Bruno Bauer about Judaism as the religion of bourgeois society, well, he's moved from that. That was, of course, a kind of polemical repartee, where he says Judaism to the extent that it's haggling. Well, that is something that all Christians in Europe have actually accepted, because that is, haggling is the religion of bourgeois society. Here he is making a more philosophically astute remark, which is that this idea of abstract labor, homogeneous abstract labor, is more understandable when you have a conception of abstract man. It is the abstract equality that Protestant Christianity preaches, right? That is the appropriate religion, because it is in that sense Marx is actually drawing from this Protestant Christianity. The next step would be something like the rights of man and citizen, which would be proclaimed in revolutionary France, right? When the authority of religion, of religious institutions is thrown aside, right? Is overturned, and the people is declared to be the source of sovereignty. But what is this people? People consists of abstract citizens, abstract individuals. This abstract conception was possible because Protestant Christianity had already conceived of it. the idea of conscience, the idea of an individual spirit, of an individual mind and spirit. This is an abstract conception that all men are in this abstract sense equal, is something that Protestant Christianity had established. And this becomes the appropriate religion of capitalism, which of course arises in Protestant Europe. In ancient modes of production, material relations between men and nature are narrow. Hence, ancient and popular religion has large elements of nature worship, which is, of course, we know this very well, that popular religion, large elements of nature worship, worshipping of trees, of water bodies, all sorts of particular natural elements and formations are worshipped. Planetary objects, stars, moon, sun, and so on and so forth. Only when material production of freely associated men, consciously regulated by them according to a settled plan, will the mystical veil of religion be removed. Only when material production of freely associated men, consciously regulated by them, by those men, according to a settled plan. Of course, he is broadly speaking thinking of some kind of socialist arrangements. Only then will the mystical veil of religion be removed, because the idea that products of human labor actually are concealed as products of human labor and made to appear as though they were relations between things themselves. This is the veil, the mystical veil. And so what Marx is suggesting is that this mystical veil is like a new religious belief, right? This goes with the argument that that human beings or man is self-alienated in this society, alienated from his true self. We won't have the time to go into further topics, the buying and selling of labor power, the production of surplus value, that's to say, what is the source of profits, the accumulation of capital, which is the dynamic. How does capital reproduce itself? How does it expand? All of this is, of course, very crucial topics of the analysis of capitalist production. These are the later chapters of this book. We won't have time to go into it, but we will return to the very last part of Capital Volume 1, which is the question of primitive accumulation. Where does capitalist production begin? How does it begin, right? And here again, there is a whole, exchange, as it were, with Adam Smith, and Marx is presenting a very different account of how the production of production through capitalist investment, how does that begin? We will return to that the next time. Okay, so we can have a discussion if you have questions. We have a little time left. Questions?
Partha, this is Rajoshi. May I start?
Yes, please.
Okay. So you know, while a lot of what Marx talks uh, about colonialism and primitive accumulation and industrialization of Europe has well-stood historical scrutiny. Hmm. But there is another way to look at the emergence of capitalism as a system, which say people like Brodel would look at capitalism as something evolving since the 16th century. And to complicate it even further, people now talk about how capitalism emerged from multiple centers across the world. Like say, even from within the Marxian tradition, we have books like Adam Smith in China.
China, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So and behind it, and if you look outside the Marxian tradition, you have the whole debate about the emergence of early modernity, the emergence of connected histories. Very sophisticated networks emerged, and there was definitely a prehistory to modern globalization, which emerged in the era of modern colonialism. So, how would you, respond? How would a Marx responded to this newer discoveries, newer archives?
Right. So, well, Marx clearly did not have the opportunity to respond to these developments because many of them came long after his death. But the interesting question is this. There is something about the first instance here. What Marx is really analyzing is the first instance of generalized commodity production anywhere in the world, which is Britain in his time. This is the context where he is analyzing capitalist production, and he is very aware of the fact of the historical conditions that made this possible in Britain at the time, and the historical conditions which made the knowledge of this particular production possible. So the entire science of political economy, why that should have arisen in Britain in particular, and not elsewhere, is also something that Marx is examining. Now, once you have the first instance, once you have the demonstration that this kind of production can be accomplished in a society and can have enormous consequences, both for the level of prosperity in that society, the wealth of that society, as well as its relations with other countries of the world, right? This is, of course, something that Britain has demonstrated by the second half of the 19th century very, very clearly. It's a dominant position in the world, and it's the principal imperial power. It has enormous colonies and so on and so forth. Once that has happened, what you begin to get is other countries where similar conditions did not prevail, also trying to adopt the methods of industrial production, right? Through other means. So already, for instance, in the second volume of Capital, Marx would speak of the second way of capitalism. And he was specifically thinking of Germany, referring to Germany. The conditions of industrial production in Germany were very different from those in Britain. He spoke of, for instance, of why in France, despite the fact that France had the most thoroughgoing bourgeois revolution, Britain never had a revolutionary moment of that kind, of the kind that happened in the French Revolution. And yet, proper capitalist development or industrial development in France was delayed by several decades. It did not really take off until the second half of the 19th century, right? It was several decades later. And Marx specifically speaks about the reasons why it did not happen. Capitalist development took so long, industrial development took so long to take off in France. Marx didn't actually see, for instance, the rise of Japan as an industrial power already by the late 19th and certainly the early 20th century. The United States experience Marx did actually mention, but United States was again a very different feature because we will have occasion to speak about this when Marx speaks of colonization. By colonization, Marx was referring to the way that term was used in the 19th century, which is European settlers colonizing other places. Marx specifically referred to Australia, of course, but you can think of the same situation in North America as well, where there was actually an absence of wage labor. There were no, propertyless laborers available there. Everyone had some small property or the other, and so industrial revolution proper did not actually take place. Factory production in a large scale did not actually take place in North America before, again, the second half of the 19th century, especially after the conclusion of the Civil War, when with the end of slavery, you had the availability of former slaves who then moved north. And then, of course, there's a whole spate of new immigration from Europe. All of these are new historical avenues towards industrial production or capitalist production. They did not replicate the forms of capitalism in Britain, the very classic form that Marx would analyze in this particular book. Now, the interesting question to ask is, does the specific analysis of capitalist production itself, is that altered under these new conditions? And these are very interesting questions. A lot of them will have to do with with the question of how capital emerges in the first place, industrial capital. How does it emerge in the first place? And here, of course, as you just mentioned, Brodel would be one person who would very clearly distinguish between what he called capitalism and industrial production. He distinguished between those two things. Other people have distinguished between commercial capitalism and industrial capitalism. And commercial capitalism in different forms in different places prevailed in quite substantial practices of commercial capitalism in many different parts of the world. They have different consequences in terms of leading to the possibilities of industrial revolution. Marx, for instance, we'll discuss many of these questions when we talk about primitive accumulation. The role of the state in particular. Crucially, in the English case, the state is not a direct participant in production itself. The state, and we will see where the state did come in. The state came in terms of ensuring primitive accumulation. That is to say, the separation of one set of producers from their own means of production. That is to say, questions like enclosure, the destruction of handicrafts, the control over foreign trade, all of these things were crucial in terms of the state ensuring the conditions for the primitive accumulation of capital, for capitalism of the English kind to take off. The state had very different kinds of roles in the emergence of capitalist production in other countries. Those did not conform to the English model. And you could argue that the consequences were, people have actually argued, that the consequences were somewhat different, particularly social and political consequences. Very often it's argued that it's because of the particular kind of industrial development, state-led, state-directed industrial development in Germany or Japan that led to the authoritarian political systems, the authoritarian social system in Japan, for instance. And of course, the very, very interesting feature of the 20th century, perhaps the most crucial of the second half of the 20th century, which is the emergence of industrial production in China. Well, industrial production in the Soviet Union, with Soviet industrialization is one kind, although very often you could think of that as a variation on the second way, the German way. But Chinese capitalism under the direction of a communist party, which is something we have seen in the last 30 or 40 years in China, this is completely unprecedented. And I don't know how to properly analyze this in terms of its relationship to the market, etc. It's a whole new phenomenon altogether. So, to what extent Marx's analysis is relevant to these later developments remains an interesting question, because it is possible, and people have made the argument, that various modifications would have to be made to Marx's original framework, precisely because of the entry of the state as an agent in capitalist world. So you have notions like state capitalism and so on, which have come in, which was never a part of Marx's understanding. The other very interesting problem, and we will come back to it next time, I won't have time today, is to consider this whole understanding in Marx of human labor being the source of value. Now, there is something philosophical here. The question of the labor theory of value is a question that's still debated. There are certain analytical problems that emerge with Marx's assumption of this particular understanding, which have actually, the technical problems have not been resolved. There are several problems: the transformation of values into prices. How do you get prices? The conversion, what happens to, when this process of from production to exchange. There are technical problems there that have not been resolved yet. And many people actually have argued that you can think of retaining Marx's framework without the labor theory of value. It's a controversial proposition, but the labor argument actually is deeply rooted in Marx's philosophical inheritance, which is through Feuerbach, from an understanding of human creativity, sort of, you might almost say, like human nature itself as being characterized by creative labor. What is distinctly human, as distinct from the way in which, let us say, other animals find their means of subsistence. Other animals too have to, hunt and forage and so on in order to find their means of subsistence. And so you could argue that there is labor involved there. What the German, later Hegelians proposed was the very specific distinction they made between human labor, where there was already in the mind, in the imagination, human imagination, an imprint, a plan of the product before labor was actually applied. So the argument is that humans are the only species which actually knows what they are going to produce out of their labor and then proceed to make those things. That is creative human labor. And this is the creative human labor which, in Marx, becomes the source of value, right? Human beings produce things of value with their labor because there is already a plan in their mind. And this is what Marx, in that remark that I made, when Marx imagines that when this plan of production becomes social rather than purely individual, a social plan of production where all of human labor is employed according to a common plan, that is when this alienation of the self-alienation of labor, which takes place under conditions of capitalist production, the distinction between artisanal labor, the labor of the craftsman, right, where the craftsman, a carpenter, or a jeweler, a metal worker, and so on in pre-capitalist society, that craftsperson already has in mind what is to be produced and produces accordingly and improves that production. There is use value that is being produced through human labor. It's creative human labor. And that labor is not alienated because that craftsperson is operating on his own means of production, using his own labor, and the product belongs to him or her. In capitalist society, the laborer's product is not his product. He is employing his labor on raw material and machinery and so on, which is owned by somebody else. It's owned by the owner of the factory. And so that is self-alienated labor, labor that is alienated from the subject. That is what has to come to an end, according to Marx, right? And this is you might say, the philosophical idea that drives this entire project of critique of political economy in Marx, and of course, related to a whole series of political projects too. What happens to those projects if that basic idea of labor, human labor as the creation of values is given up? That's a very different question. And well, we may have occasion to come back to it later. Anything else?
Any other questions? বাংলাতেও প্রশ্ন করা যায়।
All right. So if there are no more questions, Rajashri and Shobhik, could you please look for alternative dates instead of so that, because Rajashri, you were not here. There was
No, Shobhik told me about it.
Yeah.
So I will communicate with the class as well as with you.
Yes.
And we will.
I'm happy to do it on another day. But if we are not meeting next week, then we will keep the same sequence of lectures whenever that
Yes,
the next one.
of course. Yes. Okay, Partha,
All right
thank
then.
you very
All
much.
right. Thank you. Thank you very much.
As stimulating as ever.
Thank you.
Thank you. So when do you guys want to have the next class? তো ক্লাসটা চেঞ্জ করে কবে করা যায়? ওই 27 তারিখে ক্লাস ছিল না, 25 তারিখে ক্লাস ছিল।
30 তারিখে ছিল। এবার পরপর যেরকম ক্লাসগুলো আছে সেই রকমই পরপরই সিকোয়েন্সিয়ালি হতে থাকে, জাস্ট একদম শেষ যেটা হচ্ছে সেটা আরেকদিন এক্সটেন্ড করে গেল, মানে
জানুয়ারি মাসে।
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ। তাহলে
জানুয়ারিতে ওনার বোধহয় 4 জানুয়ারি শেষ হচ্ছে, সৌভিক রিমাইন্ড করলো।
সেটা 6th বা 7th হয়ে যাবে।
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ, সেটা তাহলে আরেকদিন যদি জানুয়ারি মাসে করে নেওয়া যায় তাহলে আর এখানে we don't have to sequence টা। 3rd January ওনার লাস্ট ক্লাস ছিল, so maybe you guys can have another class on say the 10th January, তাই না?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. সৌভিক কিছু বলবি? তাহলে ওই জানুয়ারিতে